Hello everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about a very important aspect of Chinese history, that is Canton trade system. I have divided this lecture into 4 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the history of foreign trade in Canton. In the second part, I'll discuss about the various actors who were involved in the Canton trade. In the third part, I'll talk about the nature of the Canton trade and the various commodities that were traded here. And in the last part, I'm going to talk about the changing nature of the Canton trade, which ultimately led to its destruction. The Canton actual name is Guangzhou. It is located in the southern tip of the Chinese Empire, and it is the capital of the most populous city, Guangdong. The name Canton actually was given by the British. The Portuguese, who were the first to come up in Canton, called it Cantoi. Later, the British called it Canton. It is believed to be the third most richest city in the world after London and Beijing. This is because of the fact huge amount of money was traded in Canton. Canton was gaining importance as a center of foreign trade right from the Tang period. From the 16th century, foreign trade in China was in the hands of the Portuguese after their arrival in the 16th century in the South China coast. In the late Ming and early Qing period, the Portuguese monopolized this trade and established their hegemony in the island of Macau. Macau was not a Portuguese colony per se. It was ultimately governed by the king, but the king and the Portuguese went into some sort of arrangement whereby the Portuguese were given the right to live in Macau from the 16th century. In 1644, the ruling Ming dynasty was overthrown in China by a tribal people who came from the northeastern side. They were called the Manchus. They made Beijing their capital and started calling themselves as king or Qing so that they sound like the overthrown Ming. The king were not very hostile to controlled trade with the foreigners, and so they opened up trade in 4 ports: Canton, Amoy, Ningpo, and Guangdong. The first English ship came from the English East India Company in the year 1689. Very soon, the company officials understood that the port of Canton was very corruption-ridden, and they wanted to open new trade routes and new ports. They found that their goods, like the woolens and other objectives and the other objects that they brought in Canton, had no demand there. They thought maybe in the northern ports of Ningpo or Amoy, where the weather was cold, maybe there they could have a market for their woolens. So they started approaching the King Court so that newer ports can be opened. Challengers like Commodore Anson, James Flint, they tried to challenge the existing trading system in Canton and tried to communicate directly with the King government. All this led to a sharp reaction from the Chinese emperor, who closed all the ports in the year 1757 except for Canton, and thus started the one-port system. The events of 1757 ultimately resulted in the Canton system, which was only recognized as the official port between China and the West until the Opium War. Thus, the Canton trade system is the term used to refer to the entire set of trading activities or arrangements available to the Westerners between 1757 and 1842. Sinologist Emanuel Shu believes that the Chinese attitude towards foreign trade was an outgrowth of their tributary mentality. Actually, China considered itself as the Middle Kingdom, or the Central Kingdom, and the most civilized nation in the world, and all the other nations surrounded China. As one moved away from China, the level of civilization declined. The countries which were further away from China, that is the Western countries, were considered to be very, very barbaric. And China, being the Middle Kingdom, was so bountiful that it did not require any foreign things. The emperor allowed trade as a mark of favor to the Western countries or to the foreign countries as a means of retaining their gratitude. Thus, trade was not a right but a privilege, and it could be withdrawn any time due to misadventure. Since Canton trade was carried out between private foreign companies and Chinese citizens, it required no diplomatic relations, and therefore no direct contact was permitted between foreign traders and the Chinese government officials. Now let us pause for a quiz. The question is, where is Canton located? Option 1, southern China, 2, western China, 3, eastern China, or 4th, northern China. The answer is A, or 1, that is southern China. Now we will turn to the second part of the lecture, that is the actors who were involved in this Canton trade. Canton, as I said earlier, was a huge populous city. It was the capital of the Guangdong province and had a large civil government. It was overseen by a provincial governor, and above him was the governor general. The governor general of Canton, or one can say Guangdong, was also the governor general of another province, that is Guangxi, and he was directly answerable to the emperor. The governor led a lavish lifestyle, lived in a lavish mansion inside the city of Canton, whereas the governor general, he based himself in different towns and also kept offices in Canton. At the face-to-face level of commerce, a small group of Chinese commercial families known as the Hong merchants were given a monopoly over commerce with the foreigners. The Chinese court authorized 13 commercial firms or Hongs as sole agents of the foreign trade. No other people were allowed to trade except for the 13 trading families called the Hong merchants. The foreign traders only had the right of petition or request to the governor general or the governor or the customs superintendent at Canton, who came to be known as the Hoppo, and that also through the Hongs. The chief characteristics of Canton trade was its monopolistic nature. The 13 Hong merchants were generally secured their right to trade by a handsome contribution to the Imperial Court. They were very powerful and they were very wealthy. The Hong merchants handled all the arrangements of the trade, provided the necessary facilities to the foreign traders, and stood surety for their good behavior. The Hong merchants rented warehouses or commercial spaces for the foreign traders, arranged for whatever purchases that the foreigners would like to make and take back to their countries, made necessary arrangement that the foreigners brought for their selling of the goods, and the things that the foreigners generally took home, that is tea, silk and porcelain. Personal relationship was a key and a close bond between the individual Hong merchants and the foreigners, and it was immensely valuable for both the parties. There was no formal relationship as such. The foreigners depended on the Hongs for the commerce, and the Hongs depended on the foreigners for money. During the heydays of the King rule, there were 3 groups of Hong merchants: those specializing in trade with European and American traders, number 2, those specializing in trade with Southeast Asian countries, and number 3, those trading with the province of Fujian and Chaozhou, both in the southeastern region of China. Apart from the Hong merchants, the only other Chinese with whom the foreign merchants directly contacted or interacted were those who provided them with necessary services like their servants, their porters, their maids, escorts, household workers, interpreters, gardeners, and a very important person called the comprador or the local handler who acted as his business agent. The other important official were the Hoppo. He was the senior superintendent of the foreign trade. He directly reported to the Board of Revenue in the imperial capital of Peking, and all the Hongs were responsible for him. It was the Hoppo who was in charge of ensuring that proper revenue flowed from Canton to the imperial capital. Thus, he had the greatest opportunity for self-enrichment. The Hoppo was, as a figure, was not well loved. He was both feared and hated by the Hongs, by the foreigners, as well as the local merchants. Canton, though, was the only port open to foreign trade. It was nevertheless a very well-developed port with all the infrastructure and facilities that were necessary for the conduct of proper and profitable business. It had good lines of supply and communication with the interior parts of China. Though this trade was a monopoly from the Chinese side, it must be remembered that from the British side too, it was a monopoly affair. The only company who had the right to trade with China was the British East India Company. Though it ultimately lost its monopoly in the year 1834. Though the foreigners had certain restrictions, they could not enter inside the city of Canton, they could not freely move about, they could not bring their families, or any women were not allowed into the compound of the place in which they lived. And there were many other restrictions, and they could never communicate directly with the Chinese authorities, and many of them considered it humiliating. But still, it significantly did not hamper the Canton trade. The various tariffs and levies imposed on the trade by the Chinese also did not prevent the foreign traders from making huge profit, and they brought to Canton year after year a huge lot of money to purchase Chinese goods, which they again brought back to their country and sold at a handsome profit. Now, let us turn to another quiz. The traders who dealt with the foreign traders in China were known as Hoppo, Kohong, Hong, or Hang. The answer is Hong. Now, let me turn to the third part of the lecture. That is the trading. Trading did not take place throughout the year. There was a trading season which began before the end of the southwest monsoon, that is the autumn, and ended during the northeast monsoon, that is in the winter months. Around 3 to 4 months were allotted for trading. That is from the month of October till February or March. The trading procedure was very, very complicated. When the season began, an incoming foreign ship coming from Europe or America had to first go to Macau. There, they had to employ a pilot, a linguist, a comprador who surveyed the ship and crew provisions. The foreigners were not allowed to enter into Chinese waters as pilots, so they had to make a Chinese pilot. From Macau, with the Chinese pilot, the comprador and the linguist, they would then go to the Bogue for measurement, payment of fees and other official obligations, and was then permitted to anchor in the island of Whampoa, which was very close to Canton. There they had to abandon their ship. From Whampoa, the goods that they carried would then be transferred over to Chinese junks or Chinese cutters, crabs, or various other ships. And then they would go to the Canton port. In Whampoa, the cargo was handed over to the designated Hong merchants, who now took the full responsibility of the cargo. They fixed the selling price, the price of the various commodities that the foreigners brought, the things that the foreigners required to purchase. Everything was done by the Hoppo. The goods that the foreigners traded was only possible through their correspondent assigned Hong. All contracts for sale and purchases were made in a year in advance. Once their business of sale and purchases were completed, the foreigners were required to immediately leave Canton. This was because the officials in Canton, from the orders of the imperial government, had no intention of keeping foreigners in the region of Canton or in China, because they did not want the foreigners to interact with the local people. And the foreigners also wanted to go back to Macau, where sometimes they brought their families, because the families, as I said earlier, were not permitted into the city of Canton. Now there's time for another quiz. The question is, the incoming foreign ships had to first go to option Canton, Whampoa, Macau, or Hong Kong. The answer is Macau. The Articles of Trade is the next thing that I'm going to discuss. The Articles of Trade that were traded in China were many. Actually, there existed a triangular trade between India, China, and England from the 18th century onwards. The most important exports to England were tea, which almost accounted to 90% of the total exports from China to England. Raw silk, porcelain, rhubarb, lacquered goods, and cassia, while imports from England to China included woolens, tin, lead, copper items, various knickknacks, and most importantly, silver bullion. Exports to India included nankin cloth, alum, camphor, pepper, vermilion, sugar, and china ware, while imports were raw cotton, ivory, silver, and opium. However, there was one factor that undoubtedly disturbed the Western traders, that they had very few goods to offer to China, and the demand of Chinese tea in Europe, particularly in England, was huge. And while the Westerners purchased large quantities of tea, silk, and other items, they were compelled to pay for it with silver bullion or Spanish dollar. Thus, it is estimated that 90% or more of the East India Company's shipment to China consisted of silver bullion. The balance of trade was thus highly in favor of China, something that the Europeans found difficult to digest. However, the situation began to change dramatically in the mid-1820s when the Western traders hit upon a magnificent idea and developed a commodity which had a ready market in China. This commodity was opium. The foreign traders, and particularly the British, were unhappy with the restrictive behavior and attitude of the Chinese government on the question of trade and they wanted to expand the trade beyond Canton to other parts, particularly in the colder northern ports, when they felt where the British woolens could have a market compared to the tropical city of Canton. With these in views, they had dispatched diplomatic missions to Peking in 1793 as well as in 1816, which did not serve the purpose or the desired results. Meanwhile, Canton itself witnessed dramatic changes as a result of the growth of private trade. Private traders always played a great role in the company trade with the East India Company. These private traders used to get license from the East India Company and traded between China and India. They were called country traders and their ships were called country ships as opposed to the ships of the East India Company, which were called company ships. Now, many of these private traders began intervention and they also started in the business of opium smuggling from India to China. Many private traders avoided the East India Company's intervention and secured consulship with other European countries and acted as their agents in China. They served as firms or representatives of the various agency houses of London and India and engaged in illicit opium trade and started establishing contacts with non-Hong merchants who were never granted permission to trade in the first place. By 1820, the nature of the trade in Canton had changed drastically, and ultimately it changed wholly from the year 1834 when the monopoly of the East India Company came to an end. It was seen that now these private traders started smuggling opium into Canton by bribing the officials of Canton and through various non-Hong merchants. They also started going in clandestine manner to various northern cities in the guise of darkness and shipped the opium there. Very soon, the balance of trade, which was always in favor of China, was soon replaced. And a time came when China bought opium with silver bullion. And with these silver bullion, the private traders started buying Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China not only was becoming an unfavorable partner in the trade, but it was also losing bullion. Chinese government had always prohibited opium through various decrees in 1729, which was again repeated in the year 1796. Opium was banned in China, but it was still smuggled by the private traders. And they started using various guise to push opium so that they could bypass buying Chinese goods with bullion. All these resulted in a clash and the breakdown of the Canton trade and eventually a war between Britain and the European countries and China, which came to be known as the Opium War. The defeat of China in the First Opium War from 1840 to 42 resulted in the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, the first in the series of humiliating treaty for China. This resulted in the opening of 5 other ports in China for foreign trade, and this ended the one-port treaty system in Canton. Now, all these resulted in the stoppage of the Canton trade and the decline of the age-old trade which centered around Canton. The final quiz of this section. The monopoly of the East India Company came to an end in the year, the options are 1834, 1820, 1800 and 1840. The answer is 1834. Thus, in this lecture, We had talked about Canton trade, its origin, its nature, the various ways in which the trade was conducted by the Hong merchants, its monopolistic nature, the procedure in which this trade was carried out, and how it gradually changed, leading to its ultimate decline. These are the various aspects that have been dealt in this lecture. Thank you.